Daniel C. says, do you think Scripture contradicts open theism? Okay, so open theism is a view that is different than classical theism. In classical theism, God is understood to be eternal and outside of time and ontologically simple, so he's not made out of parts. He's understood to be omniscient, so he knows everything, at least everything that can be known. He's omnipotent and can do anything, or at least anything that can be done. And he's omnibenevolent, meaning he's all good. Well, open theists don't buy all of that. They want to say that God is not outside of time, that he's capable of change. They may want to say that he's not omniscient because he limits his knowledge of the future in order to preserve free will. He's like, would be omniscient if he chose, but he chooses not to be. I think that the Israelites went, and this is something, that we have evidence for in Scripture itself. They went on a journey with God as they learned more about him. And originally, the Israelite conception of God was not that different than pagan conceptions of their gods. Pagan conceptions of gods are open theistic. Zeus, he's not a supreme, he outside of time, eternally perfect, all powerful, that's just not Zeus, and it's not Thor, and it's not Anubis. All of the pagan gods are finite entities. They may be superhuman, but they're still finite, and they're open. You'd understand them in open theistic terms. And I think originally the Israelites were at that stage of development where, okay, we have our God, Yahweh, and he's the creator, but he's not necessarily the kind of creator that classical theism proposes. He's more limited than that. And then over time, as they learned more about God, they learned, oh, he doesn't actually have this limitation. And so they went on a developmental journey where their awareness of God progressed to understand more and more of his perfection. And by the Christian age, that became classical theism. So I think classical theism is correct. And I think there are passages in Scripture that point in the direction of classical theism, like, where it says that in the New Testament that there's no shadow of change with God, which strongly implies he's outside of time. Because if he's inside of time, and time is the measure of change, or even if time is just correlated with change, then God would change. And if there's no shadow of change with God, and then he's outside of time. And if he can do anything, which Scripture attests, well, then he's omnipotent. And if he knows everything, which Scripture attests, then he's omniscient. And so I think the elements of classical theism can be supported by Scripture, especially the later passages in Scripture where the Israelites were at one end of their journey. But if you go earlier than that, there are a lot of passages that are consistent with open theism, because they weren't yet at the stage of development to realize that God didn't have some of the limitations they thought he did. Like when God tests Abraham to find out, is he going to follow him or not? I would have no doubt that Abraham went through an experience that could be understood as God tested me. But later, by the New Testament, we're told in James, no, God doesn't test anyone. And the reason why is, well, he knows what you're going to do. So he doesn't literally have a need to test you. But early in Israelite history, I think the author of Genesis may have thought, on the human level, yeah, God was testing Abraham to find out what he was going to do. And so now that doesn't mean that's what God was doing, but that's how it would have been understood in their cultural terms, in their level of theological development at that point. I would say God's doing something else. But they would have perceived it this way. And so the early writers would have talked about it this way, because it's what they assumed to be happening. And assumptions are different than assertions. Assumptions are things that the human author assumes to be true, even though, but God is not signing off on those. What the human author asserts is something that God guarantees to be true, and it can require some skill to tease apart what's the human author's assumptions versus what's the human author's assertions. And this is something I go into more detail about on. I've gone into more detail about on other occasions, but that's the general principle. Well, I think there are a lot of passages in Scripture that you can look to and say, "Hey, this looks like open theism." Yeah, because they went through an open theistic stage in their understanding of God. And that gets corrected as they go further in their journey and they learn more about God through what's known as progressive revelation. Like early on, Adam and Eve are hearing God walking in the garden in the cool of the evening, like he's some, you know, ancient Near Eastern king walking through his pleasure garden or paradise, as they were called. Well, okay, there's more to the situation than what it says. God doesn't even natively have a body he doesn't have one natively at all, and he doesn't have one apart from the incarnation. He might assume temporary forms in what's known as the theophany, but none of those concepts are mentioned in Genesis. Adam and Eve just hear God walking like this is a totally normal thing. And that reflects an early stage of theological development where people might assume, okay, God has a body. And with time, it becomes clear, no, he doesn't actually have a body. So though we have to look at those early passages in a different way, like maybe that's a symbol or maybe that's theophany or something like that. But we can't just assume God has a body up in heaven. So I think there are passages that open theists can appeal to, particularly in the Old Testament, but even in the New as well. One also has to take into account the use of non-literal language and things like that, and anthropomorphizing language that makes it sound like God is more like a human than he actually is. But I think ultimately classical theism rather than open theism is successful, and classical rather than open theism is what the church endorses.
And before we go, don't forget to like, comment, share the podcast with others, and subscribe. When you subscribe, hit the bell notification so you always get notified whenever I have a new video. Thank you, and God bless you.